Welcome to Things You Don't Know. Today, Dr. Deneen and myself went to look at an interesting kind of thing. Dr. Deneen, in his own unique poetic style, has come up with a great title for this, and it is When Expansion Becomes Empire, the United States and Tsarist Russia compared. It's really quite fascinating. We are examining a comparison that deserves far more attention than it usually receives: the expansion of the United States and the expansion of Russia under the Tsars. These were two immense continental empires growing in roughly the same broad era, yet doing so according to very, very different logics.
Because of the Cold War, we think of the USA and Russia as enemies, but for a long time they were on very similar paths. Um, United States expanding to the Pacific Ocean with expropriation of Native American territories, and Russia expanding in Eastern Europe, Finland, and Poland, and the Muslim territories in the Caucasus Mountains. But the contrast is not merely geographical. It's ideological, political, cultural, and even civilizational. The two powers did not simply enlarge themselves, they justified their enlargement in fundamentally different languages.
Yeah, right. And those differences did not vanish when the frontier closed or the maps stabilized. They continue to echo in modern geopolitics. If one wishes to understand how these states came to think about borders, neighbors, authority, and security, one must begin with the history of how they expanded and how they explained that expansion to themselves and to the world, too. Let's start at home, begin with the United States. In the American case, expansion was often framed as destiny. By the early 19th century, many Americans spoke openly of a national mission, a belief that the Republic was meant to spread across the continent.
That belief, my friends, would later be formalized in the phrase manifest destiny we all heard in middle school. Expansion was presented not merely as desirable, but as inevitable, perhaps even divinely sanctioned. It was not simply a matter of acquiring territory, it was understood as the spread of a social order and moral principles, Christianity, capitalism, and the so called democratic way of life.
And that distinction is important. American expansion was not only about state power, it was also about reproducing a particular model of society. Settlers moved west not merely as instruments of government, but as households, congregations, commercial networks, and aspiring local communities.
Which means the American model was in large part settler driven. The state enabled, subsidized, protected, and legalized the process, particularly through the Homestead Acts. But the visible agents of expansion were often individuals, farmers, merchants, land speculators, railroad developers, religious groups, such as the Mormons in Utah, and migrants seeking prosperity, property, and opportunity.
So, in the American case, expansion often wore the face of civil society. It appeared as migration, settlement, and institution building, even when it was backed by military force and state authority. I also wanted to add something in here, Dr. Deneen. Sounds very much like capitalism was one of the root fundamental issues here, too.
It certainly was. The idea of offering employment, of expanding. You will see that in particular in the Pacific Northwest and in Hawaii. The markets expansions, they would make Ayn Rand green with envy. Now, Russia had a completely different logic. It was also vast, its expansion, and it was more continuous in territorial terms. But its rationale was distinct. Russia expanded as a state first and a society second.
Yeah, and that may be a crucial point. The movement eastward into Siberia, southward into the Caucasus, and westward into parts of Eastern Europe was driven above all by centralized power, strategic necessity, and dynastic statecraft.
Right. While many Americans imagine open land to be settled and transformed, Russian rulers often saw frontiers to be secured. They saw buffer zones between themselves and the Muslim Ottoman Empire, defensive depth, and the need to prevent vulnerability at the margins of the empire.
Gee, yeah, I think we're going to get into some other things after a bit, but it seems like we borrowed some of that too. In some strategic ways, particularly like, say, for example, in Hawaii, which we're going to get to a little later here.
You're quite correct, Dr. Weaver.
Yeah. The product, though, that you're talking about, Dr. Deneen, produced a different relationship between the center and the frontier. And we're talking about Russia here again, under the czars. In the United States, the frontier could be imagined as a zone of reinvention in Tsarist Russia. The frontier more often remained tethered to the priorities of the imperial state.
There's also a very important cultural component. There were three pillars of Russian imperial society: autocracy, meaning an absolute monarchy; orthodoxy, meaning the Russian Orthodox Church, which was a branch of the state. Fancy word for that is Caesaropapism. And what the czars, particularly after the reign of Alexander II, Nicholas II's grandfather, called narodnost. What does that mean? It means protection and blood. It's sort of a Slavic version of the German Aryan idea, not racial superiority, but the idea that the Tsar had a divinely chosen role to protect Slavic peoples in general. So Russian expansion carries with it the Orthodox Church, all kinds of imperial administration, and the Russian language. But it was often less concerned with turning subject people into equals, Russianizing them, than with incorporating them into a layered and hierarchical political and economic imperial framework.
So the contrast begins to sharpen. The United States frequently portrayed expansion as the spread of a people and a way of life. Tsarist Russia more often treated expansion as the extension of security, sovereignty, and imperial supervision. The distinction becomes even clearer when we examine land policy. In the United States, land distribution was central. Land was sold cheaply, granted, surveyed, and made available to settlers. Ownership became a cornerstone of expansion.
And that had profound consequences. Land ownership encouraged migration, political participation, economic development, and social rootedness. It helped produce a self understanding in which westward movement seemed inseparable from individual advancement and Republican citizenship.
In Russia, by contrast, land did not circulate in the same manner. Much of it remained under state control or under the dominance of aristocratic structures. Serfdom, until the mid 19th century, restricted mobility and reinforced hierarchy. I gotta say, it sounds similar to some of the ways that we did some things with farming. You could farm a piece of land, but you didn't own it. You was farming somebody else's land.
It's very similar to sharecropping after the Civil War. You're quite correct. So while American expansion often created a broad base of small landholders, Russian expansion tended to preserve and deepen a more top-down order. That does not mean Russian frontier life was static or simple, but the governing pattern was less distributive and more administrative.
And that shapes identity. American settlers moving west often understood themselves as agents of progress, prosperity, and national growth, even at the expense of Native Americans and others. Russian imperial expansion, by contrast, was more likely to be experienced through officials, garrisons, governors, and systems of oversight.
My dear friend Dr. Martin Siegel said one might summarize the difference in this way. American expansion distributed land. Russian expansion consolidated it. Ownership on one side, administration on the other. And that distinction has shaped much that followed. Now, neither model should be romanticized. Both involved violence, coercion, displacement, and immense human suffering.
Absolutely. In the United States, Native American nations were displaced, dispossessed, and often destroyed as political communities. Expansion was clothed in the language of progress and liberty, but it was repeatedly enforced through war, treaty pressure, treaty violation, removal, and settlement backed by armed force.
Russian expansion also relied on conquest and suppression, particularly in places such as the Caucasus. We've seen that with this Chechnyan war even in our own time, where resistance could be fierce, prolonged, and deeply rooted in local identity, religion, and the desire for political autonomy.
Yet, the moral language did differ to some extent. The language. American expansion often justified itself in universal terms: liberty, civilization, progress, providence. Russian expansion tended to justify itself more openly in imperial terms: order, strength, stability, and the authority of the state.
Different vocabularies, then, but not different consequences for those who stood in the path of either empire. What differs is not whether coercion existed, it certainly did in both cases, but how it was narrated and justified.
Yeah. Geography also shaped political imagination. The United States expanded across a continent framed by major natural boundaries, oceans, river systems, and mountain ranges.
Russia, by contrast, expanded across an immense and largely continuous landmass. There was rarely an obvious terminal line. No single frontier seemed final.
That matters because geography influences mentality. American expansion could eventually imagine a continent completed. Russian expansion encouraged a sense of perpetual frontier, of strategic vulnerability, of one more step outward, always appearing necessary.
And that helps explain enduring habits of thought. In the American case, expansion could be imagined as having ultimate fulfillment. In the Russian case, expansion could be imagined as eternal necessity.
So, what were the long-term consequences of these divergent patterns, Dr. Deneen?
In the United States, Dr. Weaver, expansion contributed to a national identity, strongly tied to ideals, however imperfectly these ideals were enacted. The nation came to understand and frame itself through narratives of opportunity, movement, settlement, and self-made people.
As long as you were white, right, and not native, etc. In Russia, expansion contributed to a different kind of identity, one rooted more heavily in endurance, scale, strategic depth, and centralized authority.
And these patterns carried into the modern era. They influence how each state thought about borders, neighboring people, internal diversity, and the use of power.
So, even after the classic age of imperial expansion, the underlying stories remained. The United States often remembered expansion as fulfillment of its mission. Russia often remembered it as the creation of security. At this point, it's useful to introduce a concept we might call invisible armies. Yeah, that was a phrase inspired by Max Boot's work. The paradox is revealing. How do empires extend overwhelming power while making that power seem diffuse, natural, or barely visible?
In the American case, the boots are everywhere, but they don't always look like soldiers. They may appear instead as settlers, missionaries, plantation owners, treaty negotiators, lawyers, bankers, investors, and all kinds of commercial intermediaries.
Hawaii offers a particularly useful example. By the late 19th century, American economic interests had become deeply entrenched in the islands.
Plantation owners helped to completely reshape the economy. Missionary families and their descendants acquired a disproportionate political influence. And when the monarchy resisted, the overthrow of Queen Liliuokalani did not require a massive invasion. A limited deployment of U.S. Marines, backed by the private army of the Dole family, helped to secure a transformation whose deeper engines were economic and institutional.
So the army was present, but the larger force was one of commercial leverage, social penetration, and political alignment. This is what makes the army, in a sense, invisible. Formal coercion exists, but it is embedded in a wider matrix of influence.
Now compare that with the Caucasus and Poland under Russian expansion. Here, the boots were unmistakable. Fortresses, campaigns, generals, roads, and garrisons were visible and permanent instruments of imperial power.
Resistance leaders, such as Imam Shamil, represented a form of opposition rooted in local society, religion, and regional identity. Russia responded through sustained military pressure, punitive campaigns, and forced restructurings of space and population.
Yet, even here, there was an invisible phase. Once conquest had been secured, administrative normalization followed. Schools, churches, bureaucracies, and even the rudiments of legal routines sought to convert military domination into ordinary governance.
So, in Hawaii, force could be muted in appearance while remaining decisive in effect. In the Caucasus, force was initially overt, but the long term aim was still to make control appear normal, durable, and embedded in daily life.
These were two different methods then, but there was one shared principle. Expansion is not merely a matter of conquering territory, it is a matter of making power durable and eventually habitual. Both Hawaii and the Caucasus illustrate the same broader truth. Coercion rarely presents itself simply as coercion.
In Hawaii, Annexation could be described as modernization. Protection, that was a big factor. Our presence there in the islands and offered a doorway to Asia, did it not?
Quite so.
Or it could also have been some talk about mutual benefit.
Now, in the Caucasus, imperial domination could be described as the restoration of order, the suppression of rebellion, or the stabilization of a frontier. The czars did something brilliant after 1870. They simply put all clergy, Jewish, Orthodox, Catholic, and Protestant alike, on their payrolls. So they basically bought off the cultural and political elite.
Yeah. The language differs, but the structural outcome is similar. Incorporation into a larger political system whose rules are no longer set locally. There's also a striking geographical contrast. Hawaii was an island kingdom reached across the ocean. The Caucasus was a mountain frontier absorbed incrementally by land.
Yet both cases required the same conceptual transformation. Distant spaces had to be reimagined not as foreign worlds, but as extensions of state interest and state legitimacy.
And that is one of the defining acts of empire, not merely moving into space, but redefining that space morally and politically so that incorporation appears reasonable, necessary, or even benevolent.
So, what remains, Dr. Weaver, after the formal process of expansion is complete?
Well, in Hawaii, questions of sovereignty, memory, identity, and legitimacy remain alive and deeply contested right to this very day.
Quite true. In the Caucasus, the legacy is equally complex. Layered identities, enduring tensions, and long historical memories of resistance and incorporation. The entire Chechenian population was sent to the Gulag in World War II for supposedly collaborating with the Germans. So, as soon as Gorbachev and Yeltsin demolished the old communist system, they started a civil war and that has been going on since 1991 and makes our own war on terror look like a trip to the ball game.
Okay. And in both cases, the method of expansion shapes the legacy. Settler influence, military occupation, commercial penetration, and administrative incorporation all leave different kinds of political memory and footprints, if you will. So, in the end, we're looking at two empires and two different paths of growth.
But also a common lesson. Power does not only arrive with armies in the conventional sense.
Sometimes it arrives through settlers, sometimes through investors, sometimes through missionaries, bureaucrats, surveyors, and treaty makers.
And sometimes it arrives loudly with fortresses and campaigns, only to seek permanence through the quieter mechanisms of co-optation and routine administration.
That may be the most important takeaway. Expansion is never about movement across space. It is about the stories nations tell themselves concerning land, people, destiny, order, and right.
And the sad fact, ladies and gentlemen, is those stories tend to outlast the frontiers and the people that produce them.
Well, we could go on, but we're going to stop here and say that this is the end of this particular episode of Things You Don't Know.
We're very glad you listened, folks. Please leave a comment and a like. There are a lot more interesting things coming up.
Yes, indeed. So we will see you again on the flip flop. Come on back.